Hey, this is Ike. I'm going to be doing a series on moving up through the limits, starting at 2-4 and going to 10-20. The series is going to be a mix of the normal sweat-style videos that you've seen me do in the past, and also I'm going to be doing more classroom-style videos like this one. I think this is going to be good because the sweat-style videos tend to focus more on the unusual hands where something weird happens, I open and some idiot min re-raises and some idiot min cold 4-bets and we have no idea what's going on, and they're interesting spots but they don't come up all that much, or hands where I'm like bluff min raising the turn and weird stuff's going on. And the classroom videos, I'm going to be trying to focus on the bread and butter situations, the ones that you're going to play dozens of every time you sit down to play. And in this video today, I'm going to be focusing on two situations like that. The first one, where I raise from steal position, the button or the cutoff, and get 3-bet by one of the blinds. And the second one is going to be hands in which I cold call in position pre-flop and face a continuation bet on the flop. These are two spots that come up more and more, like most of these other typical type situations I'm talking about, as you move up through the limits, because so many more of your opponents are tight, aggressive professional players who all play pretty similarly, and in hands against them, you're going to be facing a lot of standard type situations like this. Some other ones I'm going to be looking at in future videos are these same spots, but from the opposite position, where I'm the one 3-betting from the blinds, or I'm the one raising from early position, continuation betting against a cold caller. And I think that getting some time to focus on these really basic situations is going to be good and really important, because the complicated hands are the ones you remember after the session, but you play so many more hands like this, and if you're getting the best of the regulars in spots like this, that can be worth a ton to your win rate, and if the regulars are getting the best of you in spots like this, it's going to be impossible to beat the games. So, without any further ado, let's go into the classroom part of the video. In this segment, I'm going to be looking at some hands where I open from the button or cutoff and get 3-bet by the blinds. This first hand here, I've got 8s, folds to me on the button, I open, and the big blind, Blueberry Muffin, 3-bets me to 48 to 3 1/3 times the open, which is on the smaller side for a re-raise from the blinds, but pretty normal. I expect my opponents to re-raise anywhere from 3 to 4 times the size of my bet when I open from the button and get re-raised by one of the blinds. He's been re-raising me pretty wide so far this session. Well, actually, he's re-raised me a number of times, and I've folded to all of them when it's folded to me on the button and I've opened. So I can't know for sure that he's been re-raising with a wide range, but he's been re-raising frequently, and it's likely that he's re-raising with a wide range. I decide that I've got to call the 8s here, given that. I think it's about the smallest pair I would call, though the way this dynamic had been playing, there's a good chance I would re-raise and stack off with some of the smaller pairs like 7s, 6s, and 5s, expecting to get folds on the re-raise a lot of the time. Against this raise, and against a player who I think is making it pretty wide, I'm going to be calling a lot with 8s, 9s, 10s, and jacks. All those hands I'll be re-raising and stacking off a decent amount too. Queens and kings I'll be mostly re-raising and stacking off, and then aces again I'll be sometimes re-raising and stacking off, and more often just calling them to slow play, and hope I can get a lot post-flop. 8s I like to just call because there are a lot of boards that are pretty bad for them and a lot of boards that are pretty good, and this way I can not put in too much right now and stack off only on the pretty good boards. So I call, and that's just about as good boards get. He follows up with a pretty large continuation bet. If he had continuation bet smaller, maybe half pot here, I'd have to think about raising, but because he's leaving only one pot size bet left to play, and I expect him to continue with bluffs here a very large amount of the time when I just call, I'm going to just call it and plan on calling off the rest on pretty much any turn other than an ace or maybe a king. On a king, that's a real close one, I think. On a king, I would probably have to go on bet sizing, timing, and anything else I could get a little bit of a read off of to decide what I wanted to do. On an ace, I'm probably just going to fold to another bet. On anything else, I'm going to stack off. So, I call with the eights here. Turns an undercard to my pair, so I'm certainly going with it here. He makes this weird bet of more than 2/3 of his stack. I'm just going to treat it like it's a push and raise all in over it. I guess I could call here and try to make a decision for 1/7 pot on the river, but that's just silly, especially if maybe he has a 3-outer here that he's going to fold to the push. It would be silly to let him hit it. I'm certainly not going to fold on the next street after calling, so there's no point in calling this bet rather than raising all in. I raise it in, and he calls with the ace-7. I don't really think he played his hand poorly here. I think that the raise pre-flop is fine, the continuation bet on the flop is fine, and stacking it off when he hits that turn even is fine. I think that I would potentially play ace-queen, ace-jack very much the same way I played the eights here, and that he could easily be value betting with his pair of sevens there, and that betting it is probably better than either check calling or check folding. So that was a pretty standard hand, I think, from both our sides, given the dynamic we had had up to that point. And the eights hold up and I win the pot. This hand now, I've got aces. I open them from the button, small blind 3-bets. Another pretty small 3-bet here. Again, less than 3 1/3. Big blind mucks it. And as I was saying before, I like to flat call the aces more than I like to 4-bet them for 100 BB stacks in position here, just because I think they tend to show more of a profit if you slow play them here than if you try to stack them off pre-flop. If you try to stack them off pre-flop, you get to stack probably pairs 10s plus or jacks plus, ace king and ace queen, and everything else is going to get away. If you call, you can let him improve with hands like king jack, king queen, make top pair and get it in, or just let him bluff off his stack with absolutely anything he happens to have here, and you're still going to have a very good chance of stacking any of the hands you would have stacked pre-flop, post-flop. You've got 2 aces in your hand, so another one's not going to come on the board that often. It's generally going to be very hard for them to get away from jacks, queens, and kings. And you give them an opportunity to improve or bluff with the worse hands that they wouldn't stack off pre-flop. The drawback is that they're always going to stack off ace-king and often ace-queen if you do 4-bet it pre-flop, but after missing the flop, there's a good chance they'll get away from those hands. So those are the advantages and drawbacks. I think the advantages outweigh the drawbacks here under normal circumstances. I'll be more inclined to 4-bet it if I've been 4-betting very aggressively and expect him to be stacking off a wider range against the 4-bet than I otherwise would. So that's a great flop for me. Almost everything's a good flop for aces, but that's a particularly good one. Not much improved to beat me that I was ahead of before other than pocket jacks or something random with a 9. He checks it here, and I bet because I expect him to be check-raising a wide range here. I don't think check-raising a wide range is a good way to play this board, but I think it's a way people often do. They see that flop and they think there are lots of draws. I don't want to bet and have to play more streets. I'm just going to check shove whatever I've got here and end the pot, and hopefully I win. And I think that really that's a bad and kind of lazy line with most hands here. If you flopped a good draw here, if you've got something like Queen 10 or some clubs, or even King Queen, check shoving it's not so bad because you have a lot of outs against the range that's calling you. But all in all, I really don't like check shoving that board very much. But I do expect people to do it a lot. So I go ahead and I bet the aces, expecting to get shoved on pretty wide here, and very happy to call when I do. He sticks it in, I call, and he has ace-king. I'm way, way ahead. And my hand holds up. I would have bet called that flop with probably any pair of jacks I had made, king jack, queen jack, anything like that. Probably even pocket tens. And I would have bet it intending to fold with really very few hands, actually. If I flopped a draw on that board, if I have queen 10 or king queen, I'm actually going to check it back, because I expect to face a check call almost never and to be just as able to bluff on later streets as I am on the flop. So I'm just going to check back draws on that board very, very often, because I do expect to get check raised a lot and check called never, and I think betting draws on that flop is not a very good plan. So I would be betting total whiffs, maybe, if I happen to have called pre-flop with something like 7-6 suited, which I usually wouldn't. Basher Kid hadn't been 3-betting me super wide at this point. I hadn't been at the table all that long, I believe. I'm really not bet folding that flop very much at all. Maybe ace 10 if I had called that pre-flop. And then I, as I said, would be checking back my draws. So, and like pocket 8s, I'd probably check back on that flop too. Pocket 8s or 7s, if I had those, I would check back and then get them in on good turns, not bad ones. So, yeah, any card below a 10, I would then probably get those pairs in, and I'd probably fold them on the turn if it was a worse card. In any case, moving on to the next hand. This hand is a bit different from the ones before it, because now I'm almost 200 big blinds deep. In the previous hands, I was only 100. I think you can call a lot wider when you're 200 deep against a big blind re-raise, though for this reason the big blind should be re-raising a good bit tighter when you're 200 deep, but I tend to find that most people don't make that adjustment as aggressively as I think they should. I think a lot of people 3-bet just about the same range 200 big blinds deep that they do 100 deep. I don't know what I think about Dr. Giggy in that spot specifically. I've heard he's a very good player. I've heard that he's one of the best players and biggest winners at 2-4. But I've also heard he's extremely aggressive, and he's seemed extremely aggressive in the hands I played with him. So I expect him to be 3-betting a bit wider than a lot of other players in these games were. And you'll notice he 3-bet a bit bigger than some of the other players have been, which is, I think, for one thing, good in general. Personally, I 3-bet to a full 4 times the button's open amount in general. And it's also a good adjustment to be 3-betting a bit wider, 3-betting a bit bigger as you get deeper stacked. Just to cut down on the button's positional advantage. So, again, this is one of the weaker hands I would be calling this re-raise with. But I expected him to be re-raising wide and then not really being super willing to stack off post-flop. So I was planning on calling this and really playing for pot control if I actually flop anything. I don't want to get very much in with top pair against him, but planning to bluff a lot on any board that I miss. So I call, flop comes really low and really dry, and he follows up with a c-bet here, and I make a small raise. I really like the way the sizing has worked out in this hand because I'm risking just about the size of the pot on my bluff here, and now after my raise the pot is a bit under 400, about 350. And he has to risk more than double that to get his stack in on this board. He can't really min 3-bet. I mean, he can, but it's going to be effectively identical to shoving because there's no way he can really fold over cards to this board after putting that much of his stack in because of the equity he has against medium pairs and so forth that I might be stacking off. So I'm forcing him to risk more than double pot to continue here, really. Unless he wants to call and try and play the rest of the hand out of position, which is just fine with me too. It's just a really ugly spot for a 200 big blind stack here when they c-bet the flop and get raised small. And sure enough, the raise takes it down. This is a very unbalanced play I'm making here. When I flat that re-raise pre-flop and then make the small raise on the flop here, King Jack's not an especially good hand to be doing it with. I'd be doing it with a whole lot of things, and he probably would show a profit just shoving any two on me there. But it's early enough in the session, and he has few enough hands against me that there's really no way for him to know that, and I really don't expect him to just stick it in with whatever he happens to have there, ace-jack or king-queen, or really even 8s, 9s, or 10s. It's awfully hard to put your stack in there, because my range is going to be very polarized here. When he stacks off a hand like 10s, he's almost never going to be ahead. Maybe I'm getting it in with 9s or 8s on this board, but mostly when I stack off on this board, I'm going to have a set, or I'm going to have a pair jacks or better. So there are very few hands that he can get it in with and actually be doing well against the range I call, and no real way for him to know the balance of bluffs to value hands that I have when I raise that board. So it's really hard for him to stack off very wide there, even though it's actually going to be correct against the way I'm playing this spot against him this time. So it's an ugly spot for him. Shows a lot of why it's hard to 3-bet a wide range 200 deep against an opponent you don't know very well. And I'm very happy with how I played that hand. And finally, we've got one last hand here where I re-raise rather than calling pre-flop. I open the ace-king from the cutoff here, get cold-called by a kind of fishy player in the small blind, if I'm remembering who Fia was correctly. Non-thinking plays pretty well and very aggressively. He 3-bets there. I expect him to be 3-betting a pretty wide range in this spot because he's getting a pretty good price on a bluff here, since I expect Fia to have all sorts of crap and fold it to his re-raise every time. And I think non-thinking knows that's the scenario and is taking advantage of it. So ace-king, easy shove here. Ace-queen, going with it every time. 9s or better, going with it every time. Against this guy specifically here, I was probably even going with smaller pairs down to maybe 5s or so, ace jack, king queen. I think he's folding to my shove here. It's hard to put a number on it, but way, way more than half the time. Honestly, the range I think he was squeezing here, I could maybe profitably shove almost any 2 cards. But I'm not going to shove quite that tight or quite that loose because I'm not sure of it. In any case, ace-king, easy, easy shove here. Lots of other hands, easy, easy shove here. And I'm calling that raise in this spot pretty much never. If I call and let's say we're expecting Fia to fold, I think Fia's folding most of the time there, even if I only call. Then the pot is 130 and 14 is 144 with another 400 to play. And I'm just getting the fold enough of the time on a push there that it's really hard to justify going to the flop with anything except a monster that I'm expecting him to then lose more money to post-flop. And because of that, I think that even those hands don't play very well for a call. If I call aces here, it's almost pretty transparent that I'm a very strong hand, and I don't really expect him to put money in very light post-flop against that call. Whereas I do expect him to make some pretty loose calls against my shove, so I think I get just as much value off the aces, shoving them pre-flop, or the ace-king for that matter, and thereby protect a lot of the weaker hands I want to be shoving pre-flop, like the small pairs and the mediocre aces and so forth. And so I ship it in and take it down. And that wraps up my section on playing against 3-bets. Now I'm going to be looking at some hands where I cold call a raise pre-flop in position and face a continuation bet. In this first hand here, I've got ace-queen suited, cold call the hijack open. Obviously this is a fine hand to 3-bet also. I 3-bet it a lot, I cold call it a lot. I'm not really going to go into why I cold called this time, because we're talking about c-betting right now. And I'm going to gloss over that in the future hands in this section too. There are a lot of hands here where I could have 3-bet, but I did cold call, and don't think it means that I never 3-bet in these spots. I 3-bet in lots of these spots, but just didn't in these particular hands. In any case, the button also calls, the blinds fold. Flop comes off not very dry, not very draw heavy. I have the backdoor nut flush draw here. And pre-flop raiser continuation bet's pretty big. I expect him to continuation bet a very large percentage of his hands on this board because king-high flops tend to be the sorts of flops people like continuation betting because the pre-flop raiser tends to have a range that is heavier on kings than the cold callers will, because the pre-flop raiser in a spot like this is going to be opening ace-king off, king-queen off, and king-jack off, in addition to their suited counterparts, maybe even king-10 off, maybe not. Whereas the cold callers are much less likely to have the offsuit kings. They're likely to 3-bet ace-king, whether it's suited or not, and most people play king-queen or king-jack unsuited there, either by folding or re-raising. In my experience anyway, there are certainly people who cold call king-queen and king-jack off there, but I don't think it's very good, and I don't think it's very common. So, for that reason, king-high boards tend to be favorable to the pre-flop raiser, and people tend to continuation bet a lot on them. I think people continuation bet too much on them, in fact, as a general rule, because they are favorable. I think they react to that fact too strongly and c-bet absolutely everything on king-high boards, when in fact they should just be c-betting wider than they would be on jack-10 high boards, for instance, or whatever. And I decide that I'm going to bluff raise here. I make it 111, just slightly less than triple his raise. I think that that's the smallest raise I can make that is still big enough that he's going to either shove or fold against it. So making any larger of a raise is just sort of wasting chips. So button folds, he folds. I'd expect him to shove there with pretty much any flush draw, definitely ace-king, maybe king-queen, and really not much else. Sets, obviously, and two pairs. So, if he's c-betting his whole range there and only going with flush draws, good top pairs, then my bluff shows a pretty clear profit. In this hand, I cold call the ace-8 suited against the cutoff open. Flop comes, again, medium drawy, not tons of straight draws, but a flush draw and one high card and two low cards. He follows up with a c-bet here, and I have really one of the worst hands I can have to continue on this board here, other than, like, I mean, at least I have one overcard, but I have no real piece of it, no backdoor draws, nothing. If there's anything I'm going to fold to this c-bet, this hand qualifies, and this guy wasn't totally out of line with his c-betting or anything, so this hand qualifies and I muck it. I would have continued here either, I probably would have called here with any gut shot or straight draw, so like 7-5 or 5-4. Any flush draw I'm calling, any pair at all, except pocket 2s, or maybe pocket 4s or 5s even. Those are not so good here, but pretty much any pair, any draw of any sort, really even backdoor diamonds I'd be calling here, something like 7-8 or king-10 of diamonds I'd be calling. If I have exactly king-queen for 2 overs here, or ace-queen, I'd be calling those. And I might just call everything here, or I might raise some combination of, like, ace-jack plus for value, and random pretty bad hands as bluffs. In any case, this hand, pretty easy fold. Call the ace-7 suited against an open here. This is actually a pretty similar spot to the last one. 2 small cards, 1 big card, and a flush draw. And I have a pretty similar hand. 1 over to the top card, 2 overs to the second card. This is a slightly more draw-heavy flop. There are a couple more hands that make gut shots or open-enders here. And there's also ace-deuce and ace-5 for wheel draws. But my hand is just slightly better than it was last time because I have the backdoor nut flush draw, and because I have a few more backdoor straight draws possible than I did on the previous flop. So in this case, I'm going to call the continuation bet here. Turn comes off a 6, which is not a terrible card for me. I do pick up one of my backdoor gut shots. Card doesn't really improve his range so much. He probably has 5-6 and 5-7 suited in his range to open there, though not necessarily. He wasn't a super loose player. But most of the hands he c-bet on the flop, hands like ace-jack, ace-10, king-jack, king-10, all kinds of relative misses, didn't improve here. diamonds, for the most part, didn't improve here. He bets again, and I decide to call another barrel here. The pot is going to be small enough relative to effective stacks after I call here that it will be possible for me to bluff raise all in over a relatively small river bet if I decide I want to do that on certain cards. If stacks were a bit shorter here, that would definitely argue against the call. The fact that I do have the option to bluff raise rivers here makes a difference, even though it probably won't end up happening all that often. Let's see. I don't know. On King Jack or a 10, I think I actually do like bluff raising a river bet here, because he's likely to value bet one pair on any of those cards, a good queen, or if he rivers king for top pair, I think he's likely to bet those hands, and he's likely to fold them to a push, because my push pretty well represents a slow played flopped set, or a small two pair that showed up on the turn, like 6-4 or 6-3. I probably don't have 6-3, but he doesn't necessarily know that. Or 5-7, or most specifically on King, Jack, or 10, I can very well represent rivered queens up. So I think that those are good bluff shove cards if they're not a diamond. If they are a diamond, I think that tightens up the range. He's value betting on the end enough that I am less excited about bluff shoving. In any case, the river's a 7. I make a pretty weak second pair here, and he follows up with a pretty big bet. And here, I think that because the one card straight is now possible, and there are a whole bunch of ways I can have it, 4-5, 5-6, 5-7, or pocket fives. And I play all of those hands this way. And because I'm now less likely to be calling with a crap one pair hand, hands that call and lose to ace queen here are only 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, and worse queens, which is not a whole ton of hands, doesn't make up that big a percentage of my range, and I might even, from his perspective, he probably thinks I might even be folding some of those. So I think he's not value betting very many one pair hands here. Like, probably value bets ace queen, probably doesn't value bet queen jack or queen 10. So that means his range is polarized to at least very good top pairs. Maybe he's not even betting those. Straights that he happens to have, sets and two pairs he happens to have, and other than that, bluffs. Lots of missed diamonds or just three barrels with ace 10 or whatever. I decide to call again here, hoping to snap off missed diamonds or ace 10 or whatever. And sure enough, I'm right. He has the king 9 of diamonds. This time I cold call 9s. Flop comes super dry, 3-3-6, and he c-bets. I don't really like just raising and stacking it off here, given my dynamic against this guy. Against some people I would. Against some people, I think that I'm going to get shoved on by two random overcards, or any pair of 6s he happens to have if I raise here. But I thought this guy was going to fold a lot to a raise, so I decided to just call. And plan on calling more barrels on pretty much any cards that come. Turns another undercard to my pair, so that's good news. Easy call against that bet. as the hand continues, I think it gets less likely that he stacks off worse hands if I raise. So if there was a time to raise this hand, it was the flop. Now I think it's a very clear call. Good river, too. My hand is very likely to be good at this point. And now he checks, and at first this looks like a pretty clear value bet, but as I think about it more, it looks like a lot of the hands that are check calling, the straight draw did get there on the end now. If I called flop and turn with 4 or 5, I got there. And now it's starting to look like the range he's check calling, it's very likely he does check call ace-8 or something like that if he happens to have it here, and just hope to snap off some weird float bluff line or something where I called the flop with like king-jack, and maybe turned a flush draw and decided to call again. But there really aren't that many hands that I can have here that I'm going to bet that a pair of 8s beats. I mean, I can have ace-6 or something like that, 6-5, that I called the flop with. Ace-8 beats that, but why am I betting it on the end? And the more I think about it, there are some hands that he can call and lose with here, but when I get called, I think I'm actually beat more often than I'm good, and I'm going to get raised more than never, and the couple of times that I bet fold and he succeeds in bluffing me, that's no good either. So I decide to check it back, and he turned the full house. I lose. So I think that was a good check back. This one I call 9-8 suited against the cutoff open. Flop is ace-8 deuce. People see bet ace-high flops even more than they see bet king-high flops, I think. I think he's firing just about his whole range here. So he bets. I call. I don't really like raising there. It's just going to fold out hands that are not drawing very live at all against me. And he's probably going to call with an ace. And I'll have tough decisions on later streets about whether or not I want to keep bluffing. And I'm not going to get called by worse much, if ever. He's going to shove with, or not shove necessarily, but re-raise. Maybe, shove. With flush draws, very likely. Not much very good happens if I raise the flop, so I just call. Turns another diamond, and he checks it to me. Now, I end up checking it back here, but in retrospect, I'm not sure I really like that. I think I maybe should have bet as a bluff here. At this point, I actually have just about the worst hand I can have after calling the flop, because most of my flop floats are going to be flush draws on that board, and my calls with strong hands are going to be, with pairs, are going to be pairs of 8s and pairs of aces, and pocket pairs between 8s and aces. So I really have just about the worst hand I can have here. If I'm going to be bluffing at all in this spot, it should be with this hand. So I think that actually after that's the turn card, what I should do is fire a big bet here and follow it up with a big bet, maybe even an overbet all in on the river. But I actually ended up deciding to check it back. I think checking it back's the right thing to do with a weak ace here. The right thing to do with like a pair of jacks here. But that I should turn my bad pairs of 8s into bluffs on this board. But I check it back. River's a king. He checks it. And after I've checked it back on the turn here, I really don't think that there's much to be said for betting. I think that I'm getting called by an ace every time. I think I might get called by a king, even though my check back turn bet river line doesn't really represent much that a king should beat. I think he might just make a curiosity call or a, wow, I improved on the river, I guess I call. So I don't think there's much to be said for betting here. But I do think I should have bet the turn and then followed up again on the river. And as it turns out, I lose to the king-9 that I gave a free card to on the turn, and he hit one of his 3 outs. I would have had a chance of folding that if I bet the river. It certainly doesn't beat any value bets, and it's hard for him to put me on a bluff there, but I might have gotten called anyhow. And of the hands that are beating me, a lot more are pairs of aces than pairs of kings. So even if I could bluff off the kings, it's probably not right to bluff with my pair of 8s there. Cold call the 8s against the under the gun open here. Flop comes king, queen, 5. He c-bets. It's about as bad as flops can come for me. The 5 could be a jack, and then it would be worse, but that's easily good enough that I get to muck here. I'm not going to be mucking my whole range on that board, though, because I am calling some king-jack suited, queen-jack suited, king-queen suited type hands that I can continue on that board with. I also have jack-10 I can continue with, ace-jack, ace-10. I'm only calling those if they're suited in this spot, probably. Pre-flop, that is. But I have a bunch of hands I can continue with here. 8s, pairs, 8s, pairs, jacks, and lower are not among them. Gotta fold against that bet here. Cold call the 8-6 suited against the cutoff open. Flop top pair on a monochrome board, and this is a kind of dicey spot. I think my hand is good enough to not fold to the c-bet, though. I've got the gut shot as well, and if the turn's a diamond and he bets, I'm just going to have to fold. If the turn's a diamond and he checks, I'm probably going to turn my hand into a bluff. If the turn's a non-diamond and he bets, I'm probably going to keep calling. If the turn's a non-diamond and he checks, probably going to bet for a combination of value and to protect my hand, expecting to be called by things like ace-high flush draws and bigger pocket pairs. We'll be calling a lot on the turn too, but oh well. In any case, I call here. Mick trips on the turn. He bets. I make a small raise here that's just big enough to make it wrong for him to call with a flush draw. Small enough that he can think he has some fold equity on the shove here. And in fact, he does. I am going to call the flop and raise the turn as a bluff here with things like... Maybe if I had 5-4, I'd call the flop, and now that it gets counterfeited, I'd bluff. Planning on stacking it off on good turns. Now that it gets counterfeited, I'd bluff with it. Hands like maybe ace-2 and ace-3 suited that I floated the flop with my wheel draw. Could even be bluffing with... some crappy overs with 1 diamond that I called the flop with, something like king-queen, queen-jack, with queen or jack of diamonds. I might turn into a bluff here. So he does have some fold equity in theory here. Shoving as a semi-bluff wouldn't be awful on his part, and I give him the opportunity to do it against my trips in this hand. And he just calls... He probably called with a flush draw there, which is not a very good call, because I'm not paying off if the 4th diamond hits and he shoves. River double pairs the board, and he check folds. I like his line maybe if he had something like an overpair with a diamond, so 9s through aces with a diamond, so that he has a chance of being good on the turn, and maybe it goes check-check, he wins on the river. And he has a chance of improving in addition. mostly, I think calling that turn is pretty bad. I think he should probably either stack off or fold against that raise on the turn. It's not very good to call and have to play the river with, 2/3 pot out of position on that board. And I think this is the last one here. Yeah, I cold call the 4s against the under the gun raise. Get an overcaller. I flop a set here. If it were a heads up pot, I would definitely consider raising and trying to get it in on the flop, though I would often flat call. In a 3-way pot, I think it's a huge mistake to do anything but flat call here, because I gotta give the third player in the hand the chance to bluff or semi-bluff raise here. My flat call can be all kinds of not super strong hands, and his continuation bet the same. So spa-ways should be raising or shoving even. Probably not shoving because we're so deep, but because he's so deep against me. But making a big raise here with lots of semi-bluff hands, overcard hearts and stuff like that, 5-6. And I want to give him the opportunity to do that. If I raise, it kind of shuts him out of the hand. So I flat. He folds. I turn quads. Blueberry Muffin follows up with another bet. I think that raising here is pretty bad. If I raise, it's a shove. There's not really any other sizing left here. I could min raise, but it's pretty gross, and I think it's effectively very similar to shoving, except that maybe it gets call fold from some hands. Flatting has the advantage that he can continue a bluff and lose his stack with any sort of hand that's drawing dead here, or improve on the river and end up value betting with a straight or a flush, or even if he's some random overs like king 10 or whatever, he can make top pair and either value bet them or check call them. So I think calling is much better than sticking it in here. I call. River's a pretty blank card. He checks. Obviously I shove. And I get called by a pair of 8s here. I think that probably I could have raised the set and then the quads at any point in this hand, and I'd probably stack him because he had an overpair on the flop. But that against his weaker hands and also against all of the semi-bluff hands spa-ways could have had, I show more of a profit by just calling down with my monster on this board. And also by just calling down with a set here, I protect the gut shots and flush draws and straight draws and things that I want to be floating with on this board. It makes it harder for him to bluff me off of them and harder for him to check call on later streets with mediocre hands if I mix a bunch of pretty strong hands into my call range on that flop. So I'm going to be flatting sets on that flop every time. Flatting 7-4 suited 2-pair on that flop if I happen to have it. I wouldn't really be making that call for pre-flop, but if I had, I would be flatting that on the flop too. And really only raising and stacking off on that flop with overpairs and maybe ace-high flush draws, like ace-3, ace-5 hearts in particular that also have gut shots. Pretty good stack-off hands on that flop. Though I'd even call all of those a lot of the time too. It's just a flop I'm not raising very much. In any case, that wraps up my playing against C-bet section. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave me some comments in the forums. Good luck in all your games.